Now I'm going to take a look at some population density and settlement patterns for the JAKOTA Triangle, looking at the Korean Peninsula, Japan, and Taiwan. So we look at population density. We can see, once again, where do people live in the Korean Peninsula or on the Korean Peninsula? For the most part, in the flat areas, the coastal plains, which if we go back to the topographic profile video for the Koreas, I've already mentioned where those are located, but they're found on the western side of the peninsula there along the Yellow Sea. And we see that definitely there around Seoul, which is the core capital of South Korea, and Pyongyang, which is the capital or the core, also the core of North Korea. So we definitely see that coastal plain pattern there, very urban. So we can kind of increase the intensity. We can kind of see other areas kind of along the coast here and there, pockets of dense settlement here and there. Keep in mind, I've showcased the topographic profile from the northern part of North Korea down to the southern tip of South Korea, very rugged. And so wherever you have kind of little pockets of valleys, here and there, flat areas, you're also going to find dense settlements, although they might be quite rural, but still rather large villages kind of scattered throughout the countryside. But for the most part, the western part of coastal of the Korean Peninsula is where you find a dense population. Now we go over to Japan, where we see dense population by far there, of course, in Tokyo and the Kanto Plain, which I've already mentioned beforehand, but anywhere where there's kind of flat areas. And typically these are going to be along water, so anywhere where it's flat, you're going to find a dense population. But relatively, if we think of, zoom out compared to other parts of the world, it still is, even in rural areas, quite populated. I mean, look at the western United States and other parts of Asia, look at Russia, how sparsely populated it is. And so it is quite rugged and remote. So you might have very populated rural areas and dense villages, but those urban areas, my gosh, people are living in large numbers. We go down to Taiwan. Definitely, once again, we see that pattern as far as in the western part of Taiwan, the coastal areas, the flatter areas, definitely in 3 different pockets. In particular, we see dense population. So now we go ahead and let's throw in the agriculture map. And so throw up some ag, and we can take away the population density. Where do we find agriculture? And so if you think about where population density is, those 3 different clusters I mentioned in Taiwan, there's that kind of that in-between area right there, and that's where we're going to find the small little bit of agriculture that there is in Taiwan. Now let's go up to Japan and look at its agriculture. Very, very few and far between. And let's just kind of put it in perspective. Think about China, where we just came from, as far as how much agriculture, how much farming there is, especially in these different parts, these different plains. In the case of Japan, they don't have many plains. Now, I mentioned before in that one plain, the Kanto Plain, is where we do see a little bit of agriculture there. Once again, those coastal plains of the Korean Peninsula, of course, is where we're also going to find agriculture, where we're going to find cropland, where we're going to find farming, and that definitely is the case. So for the most part, you could say besides the coastal plains in the JAKOTA Triangle, the Korean Peninsula, Japan, and Taiwan, we really don't see much agriculture. Not a lot of arable land, especially compared to the neighbor China. So there are some key differences here between these Asian countries, these East Asian countries, in terms of physical geography, but also some settlement patterns. Now let's look at one more thing here, the pastures. Actually, a few more things. The pastures, in terms of where we find them. In the case of the Korean Peninsula, non-existent. So grazing, pastoral, we really don't see it at all. A little bit there in kind of more of an upland area of Taiwan, but compared to China, look at all that grazing and pastoral agriculture, pastures that we see there compared to the Korean Peninsula and Japan. So this is interesting. And so we have something called Kobe steak. It's a certain type of steak. It's from Japan. It's very expensive. The reason why it's so expensive is because it's something that's not in large supplies. I mean, there are not large areas for cattle to graze in Japan. So that's one of the reasons why it's so expensive, because it's something hard to find. Now we look at finally the anthropogenic biomes and some patterns we see starting off the Korean Peninsula. Like I said, those pockets of dense settlements in those areas, wherever there might be a flat area, those valleys. Keep in mind, it's a very, very, very rugged peninsula. We can also see the coastal plains there as well. where we do see a little bit of rice, and also there in Japan, pockets of rice here and there. But those dense urban areas, those clusters of high population density that we see as far as where people live, overwhelmingly there in Japan. In terms of other things, we see rural areas. We do see more forests. So that relates going back to climate. So we see more D climates and C climates, a little more variety in climates. Also get orographic precipitation, which kind of creates this opportunity for trees to grow in good amounts. Now go to Taiwan. We can see once again those three dense urban settlements, agriculture, particularly in that area right there where we can see they're growing rice. But then you see those mountainous areas where it's definitely more remote, definitely more sparse trees, not as much of a dense population.